Dominique mentioned Keith Flaugh, and I want you to meet Keith and hear from him a little bit. And a lot of you know him. He's chief instigator. And we're glad he is. So Keith, come on up. And we'd like to have you introduced. Now, Dominique called you president. So I guess we have to call you by a whole new title now. Is that right?
Brand new title.
Brand new title, yeah. Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit. We talk about these things to a lot of people. But one of the things that you and I have talked about, and we've talked to other people about, is the election that we just finished last fall. You probably have some interesting observations about that, and maybe you'd be willing to share that with the folks.
I'd be happy to, Pastor Rick. Florida Citizens Alliance is a nonpartisan group. We focus very strongly on constitutional values and our God-given and protecting our God-given rights. But there's some information I think that you ought to understand coming out of this last election that to me is shocking. We have 13.5 million voters in Florida, right? We had 8 million vote in the last election. That's a pretty good turnout for an off-year election. Do you realize that 4 million of that 8 million that voted for socialism? They voted for sanctuary cities. They voted for abortion on demand. And they voted for raising corporate taxes on small businesses 40%. 4 million of the 8 million. The margin of victory for our constitutional values was 33,000 votes for the governorship. Why is that? We believe strongly it's our education system. We've had 2 generations of kids that are now teaching our kids that have come out of our liberal colleges. So it's time we stand up and fix that.
Sure. One of the things that we do is we talk to a lot of people about schools and our vision for improving them, but also about how they're graded now. Everybody we talk to agrees with us that Florida grades schools on the curve, and we try to help people come to a little bit of reality about that kind of thing. The data shows some deficiencies, and we don't celebrate those deficiencies as much as they guide us, and we need to help our kids have a chance. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your view of those things and how we might improve them.
Well, the real data is again shocking. If you look at the national tests our kids take, like the ACT, SAT, many of you are familiar with those. We took them when we went to school. In Florida, 50% of the kids taking nationally normed tests cannot read or do math at grade level. We have 2.8 million students in Florida, and literally half of them cannot read or do math at grade level. In Collier County, where many of you are from, when we can get you the data, you have a folder on your chart or on your table with Collier County data, and we can get you the Lee County data or wherever you're from. But in Collier County, 43% of our 46,000 students can't read at grade level. 49% of our students in Collier County cannot do math at grade level. Now, the really shocking thing, and many of you may have read this in the newspaper 3 weeks ago, the school district and the state just declared that Florida, or the Collier County, has a 92% graduation rate. Ask yourself, how can that be? If half of our kids can't read and do math at grade level, how can we graduate 92%? It's called grade inflation. It's called grade inflation. Again, we have to do something about that. It's our kids' future that's being destroyed.
And a lot of people know that we talk a lot about instructional materials and the desire to reform that, to have the best quality, the very finest instructional materials for our children. But there's an aspect of that it's always difficult for us to talk about. I know I'm embarrassed when I have to go to a legislator's office and hand them that or talk to somebody else. In fact, in polite company like this, we couldn't read from some of the excerpts that we hand to these people who are school board members or other representatives of. Maybe you can give us an idea of what's going on with this in a way that won't embarrass you or us, but it'll help us get the idea of what's going on here.
Well, when I hand some of this material to our legislators, and particularly if it's a woman, I always say, I'm going to blush when you read this. On your table is an excerpt, 3 pages, of the only way to call it is pornography that's in our schools. Books like The Beautiful Bastard, recommended reading for 11-year-olds in Collier County. Books like Beloved, The Bluest Eye, Killing Mr. Griffin. Now, these are all materials that we've documented across the state of Florida, and it's really not surprised because all of these schools buy from the same few sources. But if you open up that folder that you have, you can read some of this specific language that our kids are being introduced to. Now, there's really an important aspect to this, and I'm hoping the legislators listen to this carefully because I'm not sure you all understand this. In Florida, we have the Department of Education has entered into a relationship with a group called FAME, Florida Association for Media in Education. And every year from grades 3 through 8, this association picks 15 novels for grades 3 through 8 that our kids are encouraged to read. And then the school systems throughout the state urge these and put programs in place for these kids to read those. The most shocking thing to us is that one of the key requirements to get on that list is the novel has to be published 2010 or newer. So by definition, they're banning the classics, and by definition, they're shoving pop culture down our kids' throats. And that's our school system. So again, we as community members, as parents, grandparents, have to stand up.
But you left out the Pearson connection. Don't forget to tell people about that. I think they might be a little surprised.
Anybody in here heard of a company called Pearson? Pearson, it's actually a British company. Their third largest shareholder is the Arab Bank Corporation. And if you look at their shareholder list, it's many of the Middle East countries. Now, we've documented over 90 textbooks and novels, and we've documented the religious indoctrination. But I would argue that that's not the whole story. What companies like Pearson do, and they now claim to deliver 80% of all the instruction materials in the United States. Let me say that again. They deliver 80% of all the instructional materials throughout the United States. They go into our liberal colleges and invite these professors to rewrite our history and to rewrite our founding values and principles. One of the biggest things we're finding in textbooks that should get your attention is that they're encouraging kids to get rid of the Electoral College. That's the last vestige of our constitutional republic. So those are some of the ideas that are some of the facts that we deal with, and we hope that it's kind of a somber note, but we hope that it helps you realize how important what we do is.
All right, thank you very much. Well done.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bob McClure, and I am president of the James Madison Institute, which is Florida's oldest and largest free market think tank. We are based in Tallahassee, but we are statewide from the Keys all the way up to the Georgia line and across to Pensacola and Perdido Key, where Representative Mike Hill is from. So we are the state think tank for the state of Florida. The great thing about the state of Florida, and what I think is critically important for all of us to understand, is that Keith talked about the Electoral College. You really have 4 states that reflect the entire country, right? If you think about it, it's California, Texas, New York State, and Florida. You have California, which demographically reflects the entire country, and yet it's the poster child for everything that's wrong with economics, education, energy, and the environment. You pick it, that's the poster child for what's wrong with those issues. You have Texas, which is a deeply red state, but it's west of the Mississippi, and it's pretty deeply red despite Senator Cruz's recent election. You then have New York State, which is the financial capital of the world. I'm sure there are many New Yorkers in here. And yet New York State's lost roughly 10% of the state's population in the last 8 to 10 years, right? Many of you have moved here for tax reasons and the like. It's not just the weather. And then finally, you have the great state of Florida. Florida's more red than blue. Demographically, the entire country's here. You pick a demographic, it's here. It's rural, it's urban, it's roughly 15 to 20% Hispanic, roughly 10 to 15% African American, military, retiree, retired military, millennials. You pick it, that demographic is here in the state. And yet, Barack Obama won the state twice, Rick Scott won the state twice. Donald Trump won the state once. Ron DeSantis won the state once. And in every one of those elections, the victor was by fewer than 80,000 votes. You think about that. Barack Obama beats Mitt Romney and John McCain. About 8 million votes were cast. Fewer than 100,000 votes decided that election. And so, and then the second component to that is that Florida, while more red than blue, is certainly some shade of purple. I think we could all agree. And yet, I think that we shouldn't collectively cede any demographic to any, based on any policy. We shouldn't cede, those of us who believe in a centered right world or a libertarian economic world shouldn't cede anything to any demographic. And I'll give you a perfect example. We were talking about the most recent governor's race. JMI, the James Madison Institute, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal during the Thanksgiving holiday. And there were approximately, in the most recent governor's race, approximately 650,000 African-American women who voted in that election. 650,000. Of that 650,000 voters, roughly 100,000 voted for Ron DeSantis. That's 20% of a demographic that otherwise we're told nightly on cable news should be in the 1% to 2% range. Why? Why? It's because when they were surveyed, their response was Andrew Gillum opposed all forms of school choice. And I have children and grandchildren who partake in these school choice programs, and I was not about to let him take those away. Therefore, I voted for Ron DeSantis. If we can, from a public policy standpoint, make it that personal in every area, it doesn't matter what the demographic is. It doesn't matter what state it is. It doesn't matter where you are. We can continue to grow the conservative movement. Ed Fullner talks about you grow by multiplication and addition, not division and subtraction. But you have to meet people where they are, and you have to make the issues relevant to their daily lives and refuse to cede one single demographic. I'll close with this. The last thing that I think makes Florida so important is that we're in the Eastern Media Corridor. Texas is not. The Rick Scott, Bill Nelson race got far more coverage than the Beto O'Rourke, Ted Cruz race. Every massive alligator that crosses some path in the Everglades is national news, right? On Fox News. Everything that happens in the state of Florida gets national news. Why? Because it's in that Eastern Media Corridor. And so I would argue that Florida remains and will continue to remain the single most important state in the country when it comes to public policy and when it comes to politics, which places a tremendously heavy burden on all of us in this room to be responsible. And first among equals when it comes to public policy is education and educational reform. Thank you.